So what's imperative for India is that somehow or the other, India needs to ensure at least 1 decade of peace, which means no major military conflict with anybody, and focus on the economy. If India does that, it's going to become the third largest economy in the world. By 2035, it's going to cross $10 trillion of economy. And once you cross that threshold, it doesn't make sense for anybody to try and tangle with you. And of course, India is not a threat to anybody. India has never been a hegemonic, expansionist, imperialistic power. So India's rise, as it happens, will most likely be welcomed by the global south, and it will not even be a threat to China. In this century, if any nation can surpass the US as the biggest economic power, it's only India. China is no longer projected to do that. Its economy is no longer growing the way they would have wanted it to grow. There are so many issues, so much pressure. The manufacturing output is dropping, the economy, the GDP is shrinking, and obviously the TFR is dropping. It's below 1.2 or 1.1 total fertility rate, which is a catastrophe for any nation. And if China feels too much of a squeeze, you could actually have a Chinese desire to go to war with India to alleviate the internal pressures. So yeah, that's the scenario where we are at. Obviously, India's major number one threat is always going to be China, as long as Tibet is under Chinese control, and it's going to be that way for the foreseeable future.
Welcome to Velina's talk. Today I have a very, very special guest from India, Abhijit Chavda. He is very famous in India with his own podcast and YouTube channel. He can tell us a little bit about it later. But before we kick off this talk, which is going to be dedicated to the geopolitics around the globe, I would also like to highlight that Velina's talk is actually cooperation with Bharatvarta podcast, which is one of the most famous India's podcast producers on politics, policy, and society. Abhijit, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure talking to you.
Same for me. I was delighted to participate in one of your shows, and we've been talking a lot about geopolitics during your show, where I could actually present some of my main ideas about the current global system shifts. But today you are my guest, and it's going to be about your views, your also opinion on the current geopolitics. Let's start with, first and foremost, of course, the highlight of the last week with the visit of the Chinese president, the first visit after he actually successfully positioned himself in the highest echelons of power at home. So his first visit was to Moscow, the 9th visit in the last 10 years. What is your take on it? How do you assess this visit? What was your key takeaway from this almost 3 days visit?
Right. So it's a very interesting event that's happened. Mr. Xi Jinping is now is been confirmed as a president of China for the third time, and he has a very long-standing relationship with President Putin. They have met lots of times in the past, even before Mr. Xi became the president of China. So it's a long-standing relationship, and as we know, the geopolitical background of this visit was the Ukraine conflict, which has completed more than 1 year now. So Russia obviously is facing a significant amount of pressure from the West, from the United States and the NATO allies and the European Union, and other parts of the world as well. It's kind of isolated, but it's not completely isolated. It's been able to keep selling oil to major nations like India and China. And one would say that the global south does not quite agree with much of the sanctions that the West is imposing on Russia. And yet the most powerful bloc in the world is the Western bloc, the US-led, NATO-led bloc. So there's a significant amount of pressure on Mr. Putin. China also is, you could say to some extent, encircled by the West. Of course, they themselves are to some extent to blame for this. Expansionist policies, neo-imperialistic policies, having disputes and clashes with all their neighbors. So obviously it's going to have some pushback. So China is under pressure. And of course, China is facing the demographic issue. Its TFR, total fertility rate, has dropped below 1.2, which is a catastrophe by any standard. Its economy is not doing that well anymore. The Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, is kind of stalled. Europe is no longer in inclined to cooperate with China to a significant extent. Africa also does not trust China that much after all the debt trap policies were exposed and all that. So even the maritime Silk Route is not doing really well. So China is under pressure, Russia is under pressure. uh, so it makes sense for them, like you say, the dragon bear combination, to cooperate and collaborate on certain issues, and pool their forces together to a certain extent. Of course, China is not going to. I mean, China has a choice now. Do they send weapons, arms, ammunition to Russia and overtly support its campaign, its agenda in Ukraine, or does it keep on doing it the other way, a soft support, maybe give aid that is in technology that is dual use technology, that sort of thing. So China is clearly facing a lot of pressure. Russia is also facing pressure. So now maybe Mr. Xi Jinping, after ascending to the pole position, essentially the emperor of China for the third consecutive term, maybe he has made a choice that it makes sense now, perhaps for him to show his support for Mr. Putin, and maybe they want to reconfigure the global world order. Maybe we are facing a time of bipolarity or maybe multipolarity, because now we are facing more of a multipolar, at least tripolar world order. We have the US-led bloc, the Western bloc on one side. We have Russia, China to some extent, the dragon bear, the term that you coined, on the other side. And then you have a loose coalition, which is currently loose, which is India and a whole bunch of so-called global South nations. I mean, in the beginning of this year, India held a global South summit with a lot of African leaders and all that. So there is, so India also, to some extent, is rising in stature as a major geopolitical player. So all of this is the background in which Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi have met, and they have made some very significant statements. They've said that the global order is being reconfigured in a way that's not happened in the past century. So that is how I see it going. One possibly could see more interconnectivity, more cooperation between Russia and China. If China really feels the heat, they may actually start supporting Russia militarily, perhaps. I mean, Iran is already doing that. They are sending those Shahed 2 drones to Russia. Of course, they are under they've already faced the brunt of the US sanctions, so they don't have much to lose, the Iranians. China still hasn't faced significant US sanctions. Obviously, there's a trade war that Mr. Trump had led on China. And of course, there's the semiconductor and other sanctions that are being placed on China, which you could say are overt or covert sanctions. And then you have all the other issues like Taiwan and all that. So China under pressure, Russia under pressure. They are now cooperating. To what extent will the cooperation go further? We're not sure. We have significant outflows of Russian gas and petrochemicals into China. There's the Trans-Siberian pipeline from Siberia into Russia. So that's into China. So that's what's happening. So there is a significant convergence of medium term geopolitical interests between Russia and China. So it clearly makes sense for them to cooperate on issue based on certain issues. I would not say it's a blanket cooperation, because China has this wonderful, you know. They have this track record of cooperating with certain nations while pressurizing them at the same time. So recently, one saw the news that the Chinese government has issued some new maps of China's Far East, which has a common border with the Russian Far East, Manchuria, all that. And the Chinese renamed certain Russian place names like Sakhalin Island, like Vladivostok, in other regions, to other places, to Chinese names. So it's an implicit territorial claim, so to say, on territory that is currently Russian. Because in the past, the King Empire, etc., they held those territories maybe in the 18th, 19th centuries and all that. And there was a lot of territorial changes that happened. So the Chinese do have this expansionist mindset, and they do see Russia as a nation that's on the back foot. So they would like to press home the advantage. As we know, in the 1960s, China and Russia nearly went to war along the Ussuri River, the same territorial dispute that was later resolved in the 1990s and 2000s. So I would say that despite the China-Russia cooperation that we are witnessing now, over the long term, China and Russia are destined to be adversaries. Now it depends on whether Russia manages to remain powerful. Then there will be an adversarial relationship. Otherwise, the possibility is that if Russia really doesn't do well in this ongoing ensuing conflict, then they could end up becoming a satellite state of China, which I think the Chinese actually desired. When the Ukraine war happened, I think the desire of the Chinese leadership, the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping, was possibly that Russia should become a Chinese satellite state and become completely dependent on China. Obviously, that did not happen because, to some extent, India helped in that by releasing the pressure on Russia by purchasing enormous quantities of oil. So that kind of helped Russia and helped Russia until now maintain some amount of strategic autonomy and independent foreign policy. But I think the long term game from China's perspective is to turn Russia into a satellite state and turn Russia into their strategic backyard, just like Pakistan would once have wanted to turn Afghanistan into their strategic backyard. So there's a huge amount of resources, maybe half the world's resources in Russia. So China would definitely have its eye on that. China, obviously, it's facing this demographic issue and all that. So it needs resources and it needs to find a way to tide over this crisis. So these may be the calculations. And obviously, Mr. Putin is not a child, he's not a fool. He will obviously understand what the Chinese desire would be, or the Chinese agenda would be. So it's a tango that both are playing. Both have certain overt interests and covert interests, and that's what's happening. But right now, it makes sense for them to cooperate together and show a united front against the West, against the US. So that's what we're happening. I think a lot of change is happening right now in this decade. This could be a very fast-paced decade. By 2030, maybe the entire world would look different from the geopolitical power distribution perspective. Maybe some national borders also may change, possibly. So that's how I see the Russia-China tango that we are witnessing right now. It's about Ukraine, but it's also about the long term, and it's about resources and control and reconfiguring the geopolitical world order. So that's how I see it.
Yes, maybe just to clarify for those who will be watching and listening to your views, to your insights, that this dragon bear, which I coined back in 2015 after the first invasion of Ukraine, where practically China saved Russia for the first time. And at that time, the oppositional leader, Boris Nemtsov, actually was pointing to exactly this kind of scenario that Russia may end up becoming this commodity vessel for Chinese economic interests, because China needs a cheap, well, first and foremost, needs to secure the access to food and energy commodities, and then, of course, it needs to get them as cheaply as possible. So, in a sense, he was to great extent correct in this assessment. But at the same time, the dragon bear is highly asymmetrical and temporary relationship for this transitionary period of the international affairs, where both are backing each other for domestic reasons, because they always need these predictable, stable regimes at home, but also for geopolitical reasons, as you've outlined. But we also recall one interesting statement by Xi Jinping from this meeting, where he said, right now there are changes, the likes of which we haven't seen for 100 years. And then he also continued, and we are the ones driving these changes together. What, in your view, are these changes that he alerted to in his meeting with Putin? How exactly does China want to rule over the world together, obviously together with Russia? And what does that mean for India specifically?
Right. So that's the statement that Mr. Xi Jinping made, that changes are now happening that haven't happened in a century, paraphrasing. So, from China's perspective, they have a number of avenues that they can use to control significant portions of the world. One is the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement Organization, SCO, by which they have a certain amount of influence and, to some extent, some control over Central Asia, over some of the Central Asian nations. Obviously, China has very deep pockets, which is very attractive to nations in Central Asia. They can benefit from that. So one is SCO, the other is obviously BRICS, and BRICS is currently a very attractive option for many nations. I think more than 10, 12 nations have expressed their desire to join BRICS, including Saudi Arabia. I believe even Turkey has expressed a desire, Egypt, Indonesia, also
Argentina.
Argentina in Latin America. So BRICS seems to be extremely attractive to a number of nations, global South nations. So that is something by which they can increase their influence and their reach. The other thing that is definitely happening is that now we are witnessing trade of oil and petrochemicals in a currency other than the dollar. We have the ruble yuan mechanism. When it comes to India and Russia, we have the rupee ruble mechanism. Dirhams are also involved in this. Saudi Arabia may also be willing to trade in a different currency, maybe the Chinese yuan. So there is a shift away from the US dollar. It's very incipient right now. It's not something that's far reaching, but we are witnessing a desire by many nations to do this. Even the Indonesian president recently, Mr. Joko Widodo, he said that we need to stop using Visa and MasterCard because it is controlled by the US, and that can be a significant problem for us. So many nations have witnessed the policies of the US vis-a-vis Russia when it came to this war. Incredible amount of sanctions have been imposed on Russia. Russia has obviously been able to some extent tide it over, but other smaller nations will be very vulnerable. We've already seen what happened to Iran. So all of these things are coming together to some extent in BRICS, to a smaller extent in the SCO organization. And of course, Mr. Xi Jinping understands that if Russia, for whatever reason, fails in this current adventure, or whatever we want to call it, in Ukraine, then China will be left with a very hard choice. If Russia actually fails, if Mr. Putin fails, then essentially one could foresee the scenario that if Mr. Putin, for whatever reason, has failed, and if he fails, then the Russian politics is very hard. I mean, there is very little tolerance for failure. If Mr. Putin fails in the war, it means that he will most likely go out of power, and then you could have a pro-Russia regime that may emerge in Russia, a pro-US regime that may emerge in Russia, like in the 1990s, Mr. Yeltsin, and that could lead to the breakup of Russia. That is also a possibility. If that sort of far-fetched scenario actually happens, then Mr. Xi Jinping and China will be in a very hard position. So it makes sense for them to cooperate with Russia, and then they may have to turn to India because there may be no other bigger alternative. So lots of possibilities are open right now, but Russia and China would like to create a parallel world order, like you have been speaking about the dragon bear and all of what their agenda is. They would like to create a new world order, a parallel world order, and slowly push back against the so-called rules-based world order of the US. And this may be attractive to a lot of nations because we know the history of Latin America. There have been, in Central America, so many coups have been conducted in this region. The African continent is to some extent still being actively colonized by covert means by certain nations. So obviously there is a significant desire to be free of all of this. Indonesia also has a very rough history from the 1950s onwards. The coup against Mr. Sukarno, the placing of Mr. Suharto in his place, and the terrible events that happened after that. So there is a sense, I believe, in the global South to be free of the shadow and the influence and the power of certain Western nations. And because of this, it may be for them attractive for them to maybe align themselves to a certain extent, maybe completely or partially, with the dragon bear. So that's what's happening. And that is the great hope and dream of Mr. Xi Jinping, to lead this entire movement. Of course, the problem for Mr. Xi Jinping is that there is not a lot of trust when it comes to China. I mean, when it comes to the Southeast Asia region, the South China Sea region, every nation is feeling the heat of the Chinese naval force. They have the biggest naval force in the world now in terms of numbers. They are turning out warships and destroyers and frigates like sausages. That's how they're producing them. Submarines as well. And they have this dual use policy of their merchant fleet as well, which kind of doubles as the Chinese Navy to a certain extent. So all these nations are feeling the heat. So for them, it's a tough choice. For the Philippines, it's a tough choice. For Indonesia, it's a tough choice. For Japan, it's a no-brainer, actually. And Vietnam and so on. So yeah, that's the thing. So that great hope for Mr. Xi Jinping is to lead this thing and take China forward. But I am not sure how much is going to be possible, because the Chinese century, I would say, is no longer going to happen. China is no longer going to replace the US as the superpower. I do not see this happening anymore.
But do you think that because of some of the issues that you've already addressed, like the domestic issues, China peaked demographically, at the very same time, India is obviously still demographically doing very well and has already overtaken China as, as the top demographically speaking country, is projected to become world's economic power number three, obviously in a direct competition with China again. Do you think that all of these things are not going to result in a more assertive, more nationalistically oriented Chinese foreign and security policy? We've seen already the last episode between China and India along the line of actual control from 2022. And at the same time, China obviously siding with Russia. You said the war is now also kind of quite unpredictable. Obviously, both sides, Ukraine and Russia, are certainly not going to give up and are at the same time convinced that they can, still decide the war in the way how they want to shape it. So they want to win. So how do you see India's position in this very fluid, geopolitical environment? India has this difficult, really, really troubled relationship with China, but at the very same time, a very stable relationship with Russia. India has not given up on Russia because of its war against Ukraine. At the same time, is building up on the relationship with the West. I mean, how is India going to navigate in this environment? Are we going to see the new, let's say, non-alignment movement emerging out of this, or are we going to see a kind of for India first kind of policy, so rooting for India first policy in global affairs? What exactly is going to be the positioning of India in this short-term period, in this year, in the next few years to come?
Right. That's a very interesting question. So it's going to be a tightrope walk for India. India is not a massive power yet. India's economic output annually is around 3.5 trillion, which is number five, I think, in the world. In the next 5 years or so, it will definitely, most likely, become the third largest economy in the world. And yet, China is around $15 trillion, which means they're around roughly five times that of India's size and strength. And the military strength is proportional to the economic strength, which everyone understands, because military expenditure is a percentage of the GDP. So China overall is about roughly five times stronger than India. So it's going to be a tightrope walk for India. This current year, 2023-24, is an extremely crucial, critical year for India, because next year is going to be the election year, the general elections in India. And there's going to be a lot of foreign interest and possibly interference in the electoral process of India, because who comes to power in 24 is going to significantly shape the way the world geopolitics goes. If a weak coalition government comes to power in India in 2024, then it will be significantly more open to external influence and deep pockets of certain nations, which could position India as a counterweight to other nations. So if, let's say, the Chinese Communist Party is able to influence this hypothetical new government, weak government, then they could position possibly India as a counterweight to the West in some ways. If the US is able to influence this hypothetical weak government, then they will be able to position India as a very strong counterweight to China. So it is attractive for China as well as the US to some extent to see a weak government come to power in India in 2024. If a strong government comes to power in India, then the same economic policies and foreign policy will continue, which means that India will have more of an independent foreign policy and more of a what we call neutrality, or whatever you want to call it, but it's going to be India centric. So this 1 year which we are staring at, it's going to be extremely crucial. Perhaps if you look at the kind of pressure that China is under right now from the West and from other factors, then maybe they would actually want India to have a strong and more neutral foreign policy, because India does not really threaten China. India does not threaten to liberate Tibet, let's say. India does not make claims on Chinese territory. It's the Chinese who are doing that, claiming Indian territory. So if a strong government comes to power again in 24, it may actually help China and to some small extent perhaps reduce some pressure on China. So maybe China would want Mr. Modi to come back to power. Perhaps for the US, it would make sense for it would be a great hope for them to have a weak government come to power. So that's about the short term. Obviously, India and China have this long-standing border dispute that the Chinese have repeatedly been unwilling to resolve. They have been unwilling to resolve the border issue. It started in the 1950s with the invasion and annexation of Tibet. So China obviously is, like I said, it's no longer going to be the Chinese century, but for the next 20 to 30 years minimum, China is going to be a massively powerful nation and a very influential nation. The decline is going to be very slow and drastic. By the end of the century, it will be visible, but until 2050, I would say China will most likely be a very powerful nation, and India will be ill advised to discount China. So India will have to ensure that it has a credible, let's say, deterrent against China. I'm not talking about the nuclear deterrent, I'm talking about the conventional deterrent. India needs to bolster its armed forces in capabilities, missiles and other things, the Himalayan positions and all that, to send a very clear message to China that you cannot mess with us. It's going to cost you much more than what you can gain. So that is one thing that India has to do, and it's going to be it's a steep task, because China, if it is really under pressure, see, like I said, in Russia, the people are very unforgiving of failure. In China, it's even worse. A leader cannot fail. If you fail, you're done. You finished. You disappear. Mr. Xi Jinping obviously is acutely cognizant of that. He has ascended through the extremely tough ladder in the Chinese Communist Party, so he knows how it is. So if he feels that he is under threat from the US, and obviously the current the recent coronavirus, the way they handled the coronavirus pandemic, those extremely harsh lockdowns for months and all, it has really demoralized the Chinese populace to some extent. It is one of the major causes for the TFR, total fertility rate, to go down. And the main pressure that Mr. Xi Jinping could feel could be from within, because the leader must be seen to succeed. And if things are going bad, then he may need to look for an external win, maybe a short, sharp war and a victory, to reassure the Chinese people that everything is under control. So that is one thing that India has to always keep in mind, that the Chinese may be tempted, if they feel India is weak or has taken its eyes off the ball, then they may be tempted to perhaps indulge in some military adventure or misadventure along the Indian border, maybe along the Siliguri corridor, or maybe Arunachal Pradesh or somewhere. So that is something obviously the Indian government will have in mind. So China is a major threat for India. That's something India will have to do. The other thing is that the West also does not really, the US plans long, just like China, and the US also does not want to see the emergence of a new competitor 20 or 30 years down the line. So they will also want to, one could say, moderate the rise of India. They do not want India to rise too much. They don't want India to become too weak, because then it will become useless against China, but they don't want India to become too strong either. So there's a kind of balancing act that we will see. And for instance, let's take the US attitude or policy towards India. For 26 plus months, there was no American ambassador to India, despite India being one of the major nations, most important nations in the world. And now they're appointing Mr. Eric Garcetti as the ambassador to India, a person who has zero diplomatic experience. So that is kind of, it's like India appointing, let's say, Shah Rukh Khan or some actor as the ambassador to the US, person with zero diplomatic experience. So either the US is completely clueless, or it knows what it's doing. So I am of the opinion that Mr. Garcetti, even though he has no diplomatic experience, he is like Liam Neeson in Taken. He has a very specific set of skills, and those skills may most likely be deployed in India in this year 2023, and perhaps try to shape the way the electoral campaign and all that goes. So that is something the US is definitely inclined towards. And even before he came to India, he has spoken about human rights and all the same old tropes that the US loves to repeat. So yes, it's going to be a tough climb for India. If so, what's imperative for India is that somehow or the other, India needs to ensure at least 1 decade of peace, which means no major military conflict with anybody, and focus on the economy. If India does that, it's going to become the third largest economy in the world. By 2035, it's going to cross $10 trillion of economy. And once you cross that threshold, it doesn't make sense for anybody to try and tangle with you. And of course, India is not a threat to anybody. India has never been a hegemonic, expansionist, imperialistic power. So India's rise, as it happens, will most likely be welcomed by the global south, and it will not even be a threat to China or, let's say, Iran. Pakistan is a temporary nation, like I keep saying. It is a leftover issue of history. It is always on the brink of collapse now more than anything else. So I don't think India needs to worry about Pakistan. Pakistan is a non-issue. Pakistan is merely a proxy of other external forces. For some time, for a significant time, it was the proxy of the US. For a brief period of time, a decade or so, it was a proxy of China. Now it is back in the US camp. So that's something it keeps vacillating towards, but it's overall not a big issue for India. So India needs to ensure at least a decade, ideally 2 decades, of no war with anybody, no major military conflict, and focus on the economy. It's not going to be easy. There's going to be pressure from multiple sides. Nobody wants to see India rise, obviously, because it is going to be counterproductive to other established powers. So it's going to be a very delicate tightrope walk, and that's what the Indian government is currently doing. Dr. Jaishankar obviously has been representing India admirably, and what we call the Jaishankar policy is essentially, or actually, the Modi doctrine. It is Mr. Modi's foreign policy that Dr. Jaishankar is implementing. So that's what we are seeing. So it's going to be difficult for India, but it's something that can definitely happen. In this century, if any nation can surpass the US as the biggest economic power, it's only India. China is no longer projected to do that. Its economy is no longer growing the way they would have wanted it to grow. There are so many issues, so much pressure. The manufacturing output is dropping. The economy, the GDP is shrinking. Major nations are looking to shift their manufacturing out of China. That's happening. The semiconductor issue is there. And obviously, the TFR is dropping. It's below 1.2 or 1.1 total fertility rate, which is a catastrophe for any nation. So China is trying to rely on artificial intelligence and robotics to alleviate this issue, but robots cannot consume, and for any economy to grow, you need consumption. So it's going to be tough for China. It's also going to be tough for India. And if China feels too much of a squeeze, you could actually have a Chinese desire to go to war with India to alleviate the internal pressures. So yeah, that's the scenario where we are at. Obviously, India's major number one threat is always going to be China, as long as Tibet is under Chinese control, and it's going to be that way for the foreseeable future.
But maybe just to address one issue, would you agree that then normalization of at least trade relations with Pakistan would make perfect sense from India's point of view, at least in this decade, to really stabilize the situation and to have also alternative transport or trade corridors, given the situation of encirclement coming from China? I mean, this string of pearls that China was applying on India by engaging with the smaller neighbors, and given the precarious situation of Pakistan, I mean, India obviously doesn't need a failed state from a geopolitical point of view next to its border, because we know that this creates a security vacuum. It leads to more, let's say, terrorist activities and all of these kind of negative effects that are not going to be in India's interest.
Right. So Pakistan is a very interesting neighbor for India, and we understand Pakistan very well. Pakistan is the evil us. I mean, they are the same people as us. We have the same history. So the issue with Pakistan is not the people. We have absolutely no enmity with the people of Pakistan. The issue is not the terrorists. The terrorists are not some non-state actors. The terrorists are an outgrowth of the military intelligence establishment. The issue is that for most nations, the nation has an army. In the case of Pakistan, the army has a nation. They own the entire nation and they control everything within. So whatever issues exist between India and Pakistan, they are essentially caused by the Pakistan army. The Pakistan army keeps on creating this specter that India is the eternal enemy, and as long as India exists, the Pakistan army is needed to keep Pakistan safe. That is not true. So the issue is the Pakistan military, and the military, obviously, it depends on external forces for help. Let me see. I'm not a diplomat, so I can afford to be a little blunt and transparent. So for decades, the Pakistani terrorism in India was funded and financed by the United States from the 1980s onwards, and at least until 2008. After that, the Indian attitude changed, especially after Mr. Modi came to power. India struck back at Pakistan multiple times in a manner that made it very clear to Pakistan that you cannot afford to keep on doing terrorism against India. It's going to cost you much more than what you will gain. So now the terrorism has essentially dropped off, except for some sporadic incidents here or there. So the problem for India is that no matter how much we give to Pakistan, their only objective, their sole objective is the destruction of India. This is very clear. You can read any Pakistani army publication, their politicians, what they say. They have only one agenda. Their identity is that we are not Indians. That's the only identity. What they are not. They claim they're not Indians. So even if India gives away, let's say, Kashmir to Pakistan, it's not going to solve the problem. They are going to keep on having the same attitude. The only objective is the destruction of India. So as long as this nation exists, at best inheritant and at worst an existential threat for India. So we can do trade with Pakistan. It's not going to solve any problems. We can even give away Kashmir to Pakistan. I'm not saying we should do that. Hypothetically, if you do that, it's still not going to solve any problems. The only long-term solution from India's perspective is that this territory, which was taken out of India undemocratically without consulting the people of India, the role of the Pakistani army has to be ended. Unfortunately, the Pakistani army is a terrorist force. It's a nuclear armed terrorist force. So India will have to find some way. The Indian leadership over time will have to find some way of liberating the people of present day Pakistan from the terrorist regime of the Pakistan army. So ideally we would want, see, there are lots of freedom movements happening in Pakistan. The Balochis, the people of Balochistan desperately want freedom. This region was annexed illegally by Pakistan in 1948 through military force. The people of Sindh have been struggling for independence, the Sindhu Desh movement, for a long time. The Pashtun people of the Northwest Frontier Province, they are Pashtuns. They want to reintegrate the region with Afghanistan, Pashtunistan, and so on. And the people of Gilgit-Baltistan and Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, they have been protesting and demonstrating for reintegration with the rest of Kashmir, because the rest of Kashmir is progressing immensely and there's nothing there. So from my perspective, obviously I am not affiliated with the Indian government. I don't represent their public stand. But from my perspective, the only long-term solution is to essentially end the influence of the Pakistan army and let Pakistan be balkanized peacefully without any violence. Let the people gain their freedom aspirations and all that, and then the issue will be solved. The people are not the problem. The Pakistani people are the same as the people of India. It is the army that has been acting as a mercenary force on behalf of outside forces. So whether we normalize trade relations or whatever, it's not going to give access to India, to Afghanistan via the Wakhan corridor or whatever. The Pakistanis, no matter what we do, will not give India access to Afghanistan. The people of Afghanistan need access to India because it will really release so much of the pressure they are feeling. India and the Taliban government are cooperating beautifully. There is no issue. Pakistan is the issue. So I don't see a normalization of trade relations doing any good to the issue that we are facing. Pakistan, unfortunately, the Pakistan army has to go, and that's a long-term solution, not a short-term solution.
We stay in the region. As you said, it's not going to be the Chinese century. It's not going to be probably also the Indian century, but definitely it's going to be the Indo-Pacific century, with a lot happening here in this region. And what we're observing right now is obviously this also bifurcation, so this splitting of blocks when it comes to South China Sea neighbors, when it comes to the Indo-Pacific players. And here, once again, India is going to play a key role. So in a sense, I would like to hear your view on these emerging new alliances and block formations. We have the quadrilateral format, which now, as we've heard at Resina, from the key players from the four countries, US, India, Australia, and Japan, is not a military alliance. At the very same time, we have a security and defense pact. This is the AUKUS, the one being signed 18 months ago between United States, UK, and Australia. And now there is already a first strong signal coming from Japan that they are considering to join somehow. So obviously there is also this kind of trend, what I've coined as jacuzzi. So practically, if we have Japan and India joining let's say, the security and the military platform, we have, and obviously these are also the countries that are part of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing platform. So we have also increased number of military exercises. We have increased number of military presence. And then we have the counter alliance, if you like, with China, boosting the presence in South China Sea, enhancing the military muscle in the whole region. We've seen the most severe military escalation in the Strait of Taiwan last year. And we've seen also that Russia is supporting China's position, is against this free and open Indo-Pacific concept coming from Japan. That is obviously, I would argue, something that India would stand for in the future. So how do you see India's participation in these newly emerging formations? And you said, India needs stability, India needs peace. For the sake of its economic development, and at the very same time, just around the corner, there it looks like there will be more military tensions. So my question to you is whether we will see some direct, direct tensions, military tensions. Second question, of course, linked directly to the first one is: do you see military attack coming from China on Taiwan? And what will be the reaction of India to this, military escalation in South China Sea and Strait of Taiwan?
Right. So let me address the second question first, whether I see a military action in vis-a-vis Taiwan when it comes to China. China is not really in a position to consider a full-scale invasion of Taiwan or even limited military action against Taiwan. I think even today in the Taiwan Strait, in the Indo-Pacific region, the United States is the preeminent superpower. The Chinese are in no position to take back Taiwan without suffering significant damage. And obviously, then you will have this in the sanctions that the US will impose on China if they fire a single shot. So obviously, the Chinese are building the largest navy in the world. They numerically they are already the largest navy. They have a dual use fleet, also the merchant fleet, which they use to intimidate the fishing fleets and naval fleets of other nations, smaller nations. So China obviously has kind of, in some sense, turned the South China Sea into a private lake of theirs to some extent. And their great ambition is to rule the Indian Ocean as well. So for the past 10 years plus, they have been making forays into the Indian Ocean region. They routinely send submarines to dock at Pakistani ports, at let's say Gwadar, for instance, or maybe even Karachi port, and they have this naval base at Djibouti, which is at the Horn of Africa. So, like you said, they are constructing what is termed as this ring of pearls, the string of pearls around India. So it is a threat for India. India, on the other hand, is building merely defensive naval capabilities. We obviously are investing in nuclear submarines. We are in the initial stages of building our nuclear submarine fleet. Maybe there's an offer from France as well to transfer some technology and build more submarines. But India's naval position is entirely defensive. But because of the Chinese forays into the Indian Ocean region, India obviously has seen it as being beneficial to partner with the Quad, to create the Quad. First of all, for the longest time, India did not evince any interest in creating the Quad, but now the Quad is there. It's definitely active. The official word is that it's not a military alliance. It's an alliance for multiple reasons, including technological reasons and economic reasons, and a little bit of naval cooperation, military cooperation. But overall, to tell the truth, to see it as it is, it's definitely an alliance that is centered around China, because all these nations, they feel they in some way or the other, they feel pressure from China, and the Chinese have been bullying them to some extent. So the Quad, from my perspective, is definitely the main agenda is to counterbalance China, if not to encircle China. When it comes to the AUKUS relationship, the alliance, it's definitely about China. It's Australia, the UK, and the US, and they have this $368 billion submarine deal, which is an eye-watering number. I mean, imagine how many conventional submarines you can build for that number. And India is participating in military naval exercises, naval fleet exercises, and other things with these nations, with Japan, with Australia. The UK may also participate. The US is definitely involved. There is increasing cross operability between the navies of India and the US and Australia, especially, and Japan as well. So there is this sense in the Indo-Pacific region that China is trying to, well, the Chinese agenda is to take over the region, which should begin with China, with Taiwan. That's the big dream of China. I don't see the Chinese being in a position to, I mean, they could certainly do it. They could certainly launch an invasion of Taiwan, which would only result in the total destruction of Taiwan. And the Chinese will, if they have a victory at all, it's going to be a hollow victory. TSMC is already being relocated outside of Taiwan. We have at least two factories coming up in the US, major factories, and one also in Saxony in Germany. So very soon TSMC will not be an issue, and if the Chinese try to invade Taiwan, the TSMC plants, everything will be evaporated in Taiwan. So if they do acquire the island, it's going to be a hollow victory. That's what the US will ensure. It will obviously come at the cost of the Taiwanese people, but that's how geopolitics goes. There is no place for morality and emotions in geopolitics. So if the Chinese try to do it, it will be a hollow victory, and they will still be encircled, maybe even more so. So I do not see the Chinese to be in a position to actually go ahead and take Taiwan. Obviously, there's going to be tensions, naval tensions, like last year when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. There were major Chinese military exercises in the Taiwan Strait. They essentially encircled Taiwan navally for a few days, kind of cut off Taiwan from the rest of the world. So they're in a position to do that, but they cannot cross that line of actually invading Taiwan. So that's the deal. So from India's perspective, it makes a huge amount of sense to cooperate and collaborate with major nations like Japan, like Australia, like the US, with France also, because India and France have a significant convergence of interests, which is kind of extra NATO. France is one NATO nation that has a quasi-independent foreign policy. France has significant interests in the Indian Ocean region because of their territories that they have, like Réunion, like Mayotte, and other places, the near Antarctic islands and all that. So they have a significant interest in the Indian Ocean region, which has a great deal of convergence with India's interests. So India will cooperate with France. India will cooperate as part of the Quad. India may possibly, like you say, consider the jacuzzi model instead of AUKUS, make it JAKUSI. So that is a possibility, depending on how the geopolitical chessboard shifts over this year. Ideally, from India's perspective, India would like to have a more independent foreign policy, a multi-aligned foreign policy. I think the age of non-alignment is long gone. The Indian foreign policy that we have right now is not a non-aligned foreign policy. India's foreign policy today is a multi-aligned foreign policy. We are cooperating with multiple nations on a wide range of issues. When it comes to technological cooperation, it's almost like broad blanket cooperation. When it comes to strategic cooperation and geopolitical cooperation, it's more of issue-based cooperation. So that's the policy we are seeing India adopt, and this policy will definitely be applied to the Indo-Pacific. I don't see India building an enormous navy in the next 10 years like China and spilling it out into the South China Sea and the Pacific Ocean. India is going to focus on the Indian Ocean region. That's the end we can hold up, and we can certainly integrate our activities with those of the Quad, of Japan and Australia, and the AUKUS alliance, the US also and France also, and hopefully all of these pieces coming together will ensure a free and open Asia Pacific, Indo Pacific region, and ensure that China is not able to, cordon off some regions. Some people talk about India possibly in the future, if need be, blockading the Malacca Strait. I think there is something that India will never do, because it's going to impact Japan and Australia as well, which we don't want to happen. So these are the options that India has. India has many options. But it all depends on the leadership and what sort of policies they adopt. One policy definitely is to build a stronger, more powerful navy, more missiles, more ships, more destroyers, definitely more submarines, and we are taking small steps in that direction in a way that is not going to be is not going to set off alarm bells among our neighbors. So. And the other question you asked is, what if China actually invades Taiwan? So if China actually invades Taiwan, I would say that India should take immediate steps to secure Nepal, Bhutan, and Sri Lanka. I don't mean invade and conquer these regions, but to secure them and ensure that China is not able to do something there as well. Because Nepal is a nation that the Chinese have eyed for a very long time, and Bhutan is a nation whose territories the Chinese are already actively encroaching upon. The Chinese even encroached, I think, 360 or so acres, if I'm not mistaken, of Nepalese territory as well. So Nepal and Bhutan are also under Chinese threat. If the Chinese do attack Taiwan, India should take specific steps to secure the territorial integrity of Nepal and Bhutan, and possibly even Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is still far away from China. Nepal and Bhutan are adjacent to Tibet. So these are the things India should do, and India should definitely very strongly condemn and oppose any Chinese belligerence against an independent nation. So that's what I think India should do.
So, as we're approaching the 60 minutes, I still have plenty of questions. I will wrap them up with the final bundle. And that is first, as Europe is still struggling to somehow reshape its approach to China, it doesn't want to cut off the business and economic ties with China. It has a huge trade, volume of almost 800 billion US dollars. So in a sense, it's very, very hard. And at the same time, it's very hard for India to strategically align with the United States for obvious reasons. And you named some of them. How do you think these two major economic and trade players and the largest and oldest democracies in the world will cope with this shifting geopolitical issues? Isn't it actually a third way possible? Okay, it won't be named non-alignment movement, but at least if these two somehow merge forces, they could go a third way where they say we don't want to get caught in a binary world, we do not want to take sides, and we actually build enough counterweight to the American and the Chinese way of doing geopolitics so that we actually want stability, no wars, and want to focus more on the economic issues and, providing for the people, building infrastructure, and so on and so forth. Do you think that this is a, let's say, realistic way to do things by, for instance, launching obviously FTA between the two actors, so free trade agreement, and then allowing actually Indian labor force to come to Europe. Europe has an aging population, has a dire need amid the fourth industrial revolution when it comes to digitalization. India has the, is the country with the largest volume of digital transactions in the world. So there is a lot of actually interdependence that could emerge out of this. I would like to hear your opinion on that. At the very same time, speaking of Europe, we see also a European player, one of the main geopolitical players in Europe, that is still, of course, Russia. And we see actually a kind of classic example of an imperialist, move on another country where it comes to the territory, when it comes to the population. So Russia really wants to seize this very, very important territory of Ukraine. It has then bigger power projection in the Black Sea area and in the larger Mediterranean basin. And it is, I argue, the last push of, the Russian Empire from the last 250 years for geopolitical relevance, given, this newly emerging systemic conflict between United States and China. So it is the final push from Russia to position itself as a first-tier country, which will be the wild card in this new equation of power. So I would like to hear your opinion on that, because the anti-imperialism as a movement, from the time of the Cold War, and with an anti-systemic player such as the Soviet Union, has been very, very strong in country like yours, in India. And there is still a very strong anti-Americanism based on the fact that it is pretty much linked to this anti-imperialism. And at the very same time, we have a clear example of an imperialist push by one of the most relevant geopolitical players. So I would be curious to also hear your opinion. And then at the end of this session, I would like to hear your opinion on this big discussion right now in the community of geopolitical analysts about Cold War 2.0 versus World War 3. Which block do you belong to? What is your view? I'm really, really curious to hear what you mean. Is it Cold War 2.0 or is it World War 3 in your view?
I think we are already in Cold War 2.0. I don't think we are already in World War 3. I do not want to see a World War 3 ever. That is something
Me
nobody
neither,
wants to desire.
just to clarify
Yes,
that.
absolutely, absolutely. That is the thing that should be the last on anyone's agenda. I don't think even a crazy person, even a dictator of the craziest sort, would want a third world war, because it's going to engulf and destroy everybody. So I think we are definitely on Cold War 2.0. It's Russia, China versus the West. That's what's happening.
Versus the
And there's a
West.
whole
Exactly.
versus
But
the
it
West.
is not a hot war. It is a cold war in a sense that these three main players do not want a direct military confrontation. And I think this is at least one good news for our, listeners, viewers, that it's not really at the level of nuclear exchange or at the level of direct military engagement between these three countries.
Yes, totally agree. It's a Cold War. There is no direct military exchange. Ukraine essentially is a proxy war. That's what's happening. So the long term possibility in Ukraine is that Ukraine may become a new Korea, a divided kind of country. That is one possibility that may exist if the conflict is frozen at a future point in time. Now, when it comes to India and the EU, India and Europe, I think there is a huge amount of potential when it comes to India and Europe, the kind of cooperation we can have. I don't think it's really been explored thoroughly. I believe that if India had cooperation or discussions with individual countries, it may possibly be more fruitful. Because when it comes to the EU, it is more of a monolithic block. It is the bureaucracy in Brussels that decides on behalf of all the EU nations, which obviously has helped Europe a lot. It has brought in unity and uniformity and a great deal of convenience and economic growth. But so I think there is a huge amount of potential when it comes to India and EU cooperation. One possibility is that India's technological prowess can be used to help out the EU. The EU is facing an aging population. Many European countries, the birth rates are significant. The TFR has dropped. So that is something India can definitely do. India, I think, should focus on manufacturing and to replace China as the major manufacturer of the world, and then supply EU with whatever it needs, and the West as well. We have two different global options. One is the US led coalition, one is the China Russia, the Dragon Bear coalition. Is a third option possible? I think it is definitely possible, but when you have a multi aligned, non aligned kind of movement, unless you have a single focus or point of leadership, the movement will not really have much of momentum. Because take the G20 for instance. It was created as a forum for economic cooperation. This year the summit is in India, the presidency is there of India, and the G20 foreign ministers have not been able to reach any kind of unanimity, because the geopolitical angle has been brought in for the first time. So when you have lots of different people who are working together, it's kind of like herding cats. Cats are very individualistic. Sheep go together. So I think a non-aligned kind of movement cannot really be a significant long-term counterweight to two quasi-imperialistic powers. The US, India, like you correctly said, has this very strong anti-imperialistic sentiment because of the past 1,000 years of history in India, when we have been invaded and conquered and occupied by foreign imperialistic forces. So that is something we definitely have. And we also, now people are beginning to perceive it in a certain way, that when it comes to the British Empire, it never really ended. The capital of the British Empire was merely transferred from London, UK to Washington, DC, and the entire infrastructure of the empire doesn't just exist, it has actually been enhanced. And so that is something that it's not really anti-Americanism, it's anti-imperialism. And it's because of the past history that Indians have this very strong sentiment. And of course, when we look at the Russian history, if you look at their push eastwards over the past 2-3 centuries, they conquered enormous territories in Siberia that were never Russian, that were never Slavic. And they obviously did this process of Russification on the Turkic people who lived in these regions. And that's how they've expanded all the way to the far east of Russia and even Alaska at one point in time. So Russia is definitely an empire, no doubt about it. It is today a nation state, but it's truly really an empire. China also is an imperial system. And to some extent, you could say that the US is an empire masquerading as a democracy. It's a two-party state, just one step above a one-party system. So that's something that most people don't see. So I think non-alignment is something that has been tried actually in the past, and that movement never took much momentum. It eventually died out. So I don't think non-alignment could really work in the long term. It could not be a very viable and a strong option to the other two blocks that we already have. There is this global south movement, but I don't see how far it can go and how much traction it can gain. You need a strong center of gravity or leadership for this to happen. But for that, you need control over the entire populace and the nations. So that's how I see it.
Well, I think that we managed to remain disciplined, and we obviously have to come together. And I will be more than delighted to invite you again and discuss all of these relevant topics. The growing role of India in the global south is something that will, I think, get manifested this year, specifically with the summit in September and the alternative, if you like, a narrative and model that India is going to present, alternative to the Chinese, obviously to the Chinese BRI and to the Chinese geostrategy in terms of 6 billion people around the world. I think this is obviously good news. There's not going to be World War III. That is obviously also, I think, good news. There is not going to be a nuclear exchange. I mean, China is clearly, and India as well, are very clear on that matter. And normalization of relations with neighbors is something that for me is a big takeaway, because it's not just about bad news when it comes to geopolitics. It's very often also about good news, where countries, even though that they are rivals, decide to come together because of a shared geopolitical or geoeconomic interest, like we saw with the Saudi Iranian deal, right? So maybe we will see something similar at a much higher level also between India and Pakistan. And once again, thank you for taking your time, and thank you for covering so many broad issues. And I look forward to hosting you again.
Thank you very much, Velina. Great pleasure talking to you.
Always a great pleasure.